Welcome back to the Political Brief. Today, we're going back to a Senate confirmation hearing where Senator Ted Cruz confronted Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson over a question that still sparks intense debate. What exactly are children being taught about race in America's schools? Cruz brought up books recommended to young students, including Antiracist Baby and Stamped for kids, and asked whether children should be exposed to ideas suggesting that there is no racial neutrality. Judge Jackson pushed back on the premise and emphasized that she was appearing as a judicial nominee, not as an education policymaker. But there's a bigger question underneath this exchange, and it's one we absolutely need to talk about. Let's get into it.
So, Judge Jackson, all of us will agree that no one should be discriminated against because of race. When you just testified a minute ago that you didn't know if critical race theory was taught in K through 12, I will confess I find that statement a little hard to reconcile with the public record, because if you look at the Georgetown Day School's curriculum, it is filled and overflowing with critical race theory. That among the books that are either assigned or recommended, they include Critical Race Theory, an introduction. They include The End of Policing, an advocacy for abolishing police. They include How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. They include literally stacks and stacks of books, and I'll tell you two of the ones that were most stunning. They include a book called Antiracist Baby by Ibram Kendi. And there are portions of this book that I find really quite remarkable. One portion of the book says babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There is no neutrality. Another portion of the book, they recommend to babies confess when being racist. Now, this is a book that is taught at Georgetown Day School to students in pre-K through second grade, so 4 through 7 years old. Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
Senator, I do not believe that any child should be made to feel as though they are racist, or though they are not valued, or though they are less than, that they are victims, that they are oppressors. I don't believe in any of that. But what I will say is that when you asked me whether or not this was taught in schools, critical race theory, my understanding is that critical race theory as an academic theory is taught in law schools, and to the extent that you were asking the question, I understood you to be addressing public schools. Georgetown Day School, just like the religious school that Justice Barrett was on the board of, is a private school.
Okay, so you agree critical race theory is taught at Georgetown Day School?
I don't know, because the board is not, the board does not control the curriculum. The board does not focus on that. That's not what we do as board members, so I'm actually not sure.
Well, and I'll note that the board is chaired by Professor Fairfax, your college roommate who introduced you yesterday, so the two of you serve on the board together. Another book that is on the summer reading for 3rd through 5th grade is a book called Stamped for Kids, again by Ibram Kendi. I read the entirety of the book, and I will say it is an astonishing book. On page 33, it asks the question, can we send white people back to Europe? That's on 33. That's what's being given to 8 and 9 years old. It also, on page 115, says the idea that we should pretend not to see racism is connected to the idea that we should pretend not to see color. It's called color blindness. Skipping ahead, here's what's wrong with this. It's ridiculous. Skin color is something we all absolutely see. Skipping ahead, so to pretend not to see color is pretty convenient if you don't actually want to stamp out racism in the first place. Now, what this book argues for is the exact opposite of what Dr. King spoke about on the floor of the Lincoln Memorial. And are you comfortable with these ideas being taught to children as young as 4 in respect to the first book, as young as 8 and 9 in respect to the second book?
Senator, I have not reviewed any of those books, any of those ideas. They don't come up in my work as a judge, which I'm respectfully here to address. In my work as a judge, which is evidenced from my near decade on the bench.
Okay, good. Then let's go back to your work as a judge.
Senator Cruz came into this exchange with a very specific argument. Nobody should be discriminated against because of race, but Americans also have a right to question what children are being taught about race. And honestly, I think that's where this conversation needs to begin, because there are two completely different questions being mixed together here. The first question is whether racism exists. Of course it does. The second question is whether children should be taught that racial identity determines whether someone is an oppressor, a victim, racist, or anti-racist. That is a completely different question, and parents have every right to ask what is being taught to their children. Now, I want to be fair to Judge Jackson here because this exchange has been debated for years, and there's an important distinction that shouldn't be ignored. Judge Jackson repeatedly said she had not reviewed the books Cruz was referencing and that she was not involved in the school's curriculum decisions. She also clarified that when Cruz initially asked about critical race theory, she understood him to be asking about public schools, while Georgetown Day School is a private institution. That's a legitimate point. A judge serving on a private school's board isn't necessarily the person writing the school's curriculum. So if we're being intellectually honest, we shouldn't pretend Judge Jackson personally selected these books or personally ordered children to read them. But here's the part that I think Cruz was getting at, and I think it's still worth discussing. If a school is recommending books to children as young as 4 years old, parents have a right to examine those books and ask questions. That's not extremism. That's parenting. And the particular example Cruz brought up was Antiracist Baby. The concern he raised was the book's argument that babies are being taught to be racist or anti-racist, and that there is no neutrality. Now, reasonable people can debate what the author intended by that language. But let's step back for a second. We're talking about very young children, 4-year-olds. At that age, children are learning basic concepts about the world around them. They're learning how to read. They're learning numbers. They're learning how to share. They're learning how to communicate with other children. So when you introduce complicated theories about race and racial identity to very young children, parents are perfectly justified in asking, what exactly are you trying to teach them? Are you teaching children that racism is wrong? That's obviously appropriate. Are you teaching children to treat people equally? Absolutely. Are you teaching children that discrimination based on race is wrong? Of course. But if the lesson becomes that children should view themselves through a racial hierarchy, or that they should categorize themselves or others as oppressors and victims based primarily on skin color, then I think parents have every right to object. And this is where I believe conservatives have a legitimate criticism of some modern approaches to race education. There is a difference between teaching children about racism and teaching children to interpret almost every social relationship through race. Those aren't automatically the same thing. America has spent generations trying to move beyond a system where people were judged by their race. So it's completely reasonable for conservatives to ask whether some modern educational approaches are accidentally bringing racial categorization back into the center of children's lives. And that's why the reference to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes important. The basic ideal most Americans associate with King's famous message was that people should ultimately be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Now, that doesn't mean we pretend racism never happened. It doesn't mean we ignore America's history. It doesn't mean we refuse to talk about slavery, segregation, discrimination, or the civil rights movement. We absolutely should teach history honestly. But there's a difference between teaching children that America has struggled with racism and teaching children that their racial identity determines their place in society. I think the first is education. The second deserves serious scrutiny. And that's why I don't think this issue should simply be dismissed as conservatives being afraid to talk about race. That's an easy way to avoid the actual debate. The real question is, what is the appropriate way to teach children about race? Because there are legitimate concerns on both sides. We don't want children growing up believing racism doesn't exist. But we also don't want children growing up believing that every white child is somehow responsible for historical injustice, or that every minority child is inherently a victim. Neither idea is healthy. And Judge Jackson actually made a statement during this exchange that I think is important. She said she did not believe any child should be made to feel as though they are racist, less than, not valued, a victim, or an oppressor. That's a principle I can agree with. And if that's genuinely the standard, then good. That's exactly how children should be treated. But then we have to apply that principle consistently. If we don't want a black child being told they're inferior because of their race, we shouldn't want a white child being told they're inherently privileged, oppressive, or morally responsible because of their race either. The standard should be the same. That's equality. And this is where I think the broader political debate often gets lost. Some people hear conservatives criticize critical race theory or anti-racist education and immediately assume conservatives are arguing against teaching American history. That's not what I'm arguing for. I want children to know about slavery. I want children to know about segregation. I want children to know about the civil rights movement. I want them to know about the sacrifices made by Americans who fought for equal rights. I want them to know about the Constitution and the principles of individual liberty. I want them to understand that discrimination is wrong. But I also want them to understand that they are individuals, not representatives of a racial category, not guilty because of their ancestry, not victims because of their ancestry. Individuals. That's the conservative argument I think is worth defending. Now, Cruz also brought up Stamped for Kids, another book associated with Ibram Kendi, and raised concerns about passages discussing race and colorblindness. Again, this is where we need to be careful. A quotation from a book can sound shocking when presented in isolation, so people should actually examine the material and its context before making sweeping claims about what an entire school system teaches. But the broader concern about colorblindness is interesting. The idea of treating people equally regardless of race is traditionally considered one of the core goals of the American civil rights movement. Yet some modern racial theories argue that being colorblind can itself prevent people from recognizing racial inequality. That's a legitimate academic argument. People are allowed to make it. But here's where I think conservatives have an important response. Recognizing racial differences in society is one thing. Making race the primary lens through which children understand themselves and everyone around them is another. And I don't think we should be afraid to say that. There is a danger in both extremes. On one extreme, you have people who want to pretend racism disappeared decades ago. That's obviously false. On the other extreme, you have people who seem to interpret every interaction, every institution, and every disagreement primarily through race. That can create a society where racial identity becomes even more important than it was before. And isn't the goal supposed to be the opposite? Shouldn't we eventually reach a point where someone's skin color isn't constantly being brought into every conversation? That's not hatred. That's the aspiration of equality. And here's another important point. Parents are not stupid. They're not bigots simply because they ask questions about a school's curriculum. They're not extremists because they want to know what books their children are reading. They're not racist because they don't want their 4-year-old being introduced to complicated political theories about race. Parents have a fundamental interest in their children's education, and schools should be prepared to answer questions. If the material is perfectly appropriate, explain why. If parents misunderstand something, explain it. If a book is being used in a particular context, explain the context. But dismissing parents as ignorant or hateful because they ask questions is not going to build trust. And frankly, institutions have brought some of this skepticism upon themselves. Over the past several years, there's been a growing sense among many Americans that important decisions are being made without enough transparency. That's true in education. It's true in government. It's true in corporations. And it's true in universities. When parents feel like they're being left out of the conversation about what their children are learning, they're naturally going to become suspicious. And when they're told, "Don't worry about it, you're just misunderstanding," that often makes the suspicion worse. Transparency would solve a lot of this. Tell parents what's being taught. Give them access to the curriculum. Explain why particular books are being used. Allow reasonable debate. And then let parents make informed decisions. That's much healthier than turning every curriculum dispute into a political war. Now, I also want to address something Cruz said about Georgetown Day School and Judge Jackson's connection to the school's board. Cruz pointed out that the board was chaired by a professor who was also Jackson's former college roommate. That certainly makes the relationship worth noting, but we shouldn't automatically leap from that connection to the conclusion that Judge Jackson endorsed every book on the school's reading list. That's not established by this exchange. And this is where political commentary has to be responsible. Being conservative doesn't mean believing every accusation made by a Republican senator. It means having principles. If the evidence supports the criticism, make the criticism. If the evidence doesn't establish something, say that too. That's how you maintain credibility. But I think the underlying question remains completely legitimate. What should America's children be taught about race? And my answer is pretty straightforward. Teach them the truth. Teach them the good. Teach them the bad. Teach them the history. Teach them slavery. Teach them segregation. Teach them the civil rights movement. Teach them the Constitution. Teach them the sacrifices made to establish equal rights. Teach them that racism is wrong. Teach them that discrimination is wrong. But also teach them that an individual is not morally responsible for something simply because of the color of their skin. Teach them that their character matters. Teach them that their choices matter. Teach them that they have control over who they become. And most importantly, teach them to judge other people as individuals. Because I don't believe America needs another generation obsessed with racial categories. I believe America needs another generation confident enough to reject racial discrimination altogether. And that includes rejecting discrimination when it is directed at minorities. But it also includes rejecting discrimination when it is directed at white Americans. The principle has to work both ways. If we say racism is wrong, then racism is wrong. Not wrong when they do it. Wrong. Period. And that's why I think this hearing remains relevant. The argument isn't simply about Judge Jackson. It isn't even simply about Senator Cruz. It's about a much bigger question that parents across America continue to wrestle with. How do we teach children about America's complicated racial history without teaching them to hate themselves, hate other people, or define themselves primarily through race? That's a difficult question. But difficult questions are exactly what adults should be willing to discuss. And we don't need to scream at each other to have that conversation. We can disagree. We can debate. We can read the books ourselves. We can look at the curriculum. We can listen to parents. We can listen to teachers. And then we can decide what kind of education we want for the next generation. Personally, I think the goal should be simple. Teach children to recognize racism without teaching them to see racism everywhere. Teach them about racial history without making race their entire identity. Teach equality without replacing one racial hierarchy with another. And teach children that they are capable of becoming something greater than the circumstances they were born into. That's the America I believe in. And that's why this exchange between Cruz and Judge Jackson deserves more than a partisan soundbite. There are legitimate points on both sides, but there's also a very legitimate concern about whether some educational approaches are going too far. Parents should be able to ask that question. They should be able to demand answers. And they should never be shamed for caring about what their children are taught. At the same time, conservatives should be willing to acknowledge when the evidence doesn't support an accusation. Because the goal shouldn't be to score political points. The goal should be getting the education question right. Our children deserve better than political propaganda from either side. They deserve an education that teaches them history, critical thinking, individual responsibility, and respect for every human being. And if we can agree on that foundation, maybe we can finally have a serious conversation about the rest. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether America should teach children about race. Of course it should. The question is how we teach them about race. and whether we're preparing them to build a country where racial discrimination actually becomes less important over time, rather than making race an even bigger part of how they see themselves and everyone around them. That's the conversation America needs to have, and parents deserve a seat at the table. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to The Political Brief, hit the like button, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think schools should teach children about race primarily through American history and individual equality, or should they place more emphasis on systemic racism and racial identity? And most importantly, how young is too young for these conversations? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.